In this video, we're going to start by taking a look at removing the power assist steering rack and pinion from the Toyota Hi-Ace commuter van by detaching it from its cross-member support. Here you can see we are getting some oil leak from the inner tie rod seal. Also disconnecting of the outer tie rod, disconnecting these 10mm bolts for the power steering line, disconnecting of the low pressure line and the high pressure line. But first we must disconnect these two bolts for the steering shaft and then detach it from the steering linkage, which will have to be pushed back so it could be removed from the rack and pinion shaft. So the first thing we want to do here is make sure we remove the steering shaft. Then we could remove the outer tie rod, the mounting support, and remove the rack and pinion from the vehicle. With those two 12mm bolts removed from the steering shaft, we'll now take an open-end wrench and insert it between the shaft and the rack and pinion, hammering it with a mallet, preferably a rubber hammer, not a steel hammer, and it will detach. It'll be a little difficult, but it'll take some time. It's that easy. So once this is off the rack and pinion, you can slide it out. You see this spline is what able to slide back for removal and adjustment. Using a 19mm combination wrench, preferably the box end, for on-tightening and removal of the two front bolts on the rack and pinion is essential. To the left side of the rack and pinion, you will notice a shorter 19mm bolt when compared to the right side. Please make a note of it. With the two front bolts for the rack and pinion removed, it is now time for us to proceed with a different method for removing the rear 19mm bolts on the rack and pinion. These are the locations for those four 19mm bolts that holds the rack and pinion to the vehicle cross-member support. Using a 1/2-inch drive ratchet with a long 19mm impact socket, preferably 6-point drive, for removing the rear bolts. Now it's time for unlocking the inner tie rod from the outer tie rod. When doing so, you want to make sure you count the number of threads to retain the alignment for the suspension when these parts are to be replaced. Same thing for the left side. unlocking of the tie rod nut and retaining a count of its threads to maintain straight line alignment. Using the thread count on the inner tie rod shaft for retaining alignment after the suspension has been fit together is one of the safest way for getting the vehicle to a wheel alignment center or a alignment machine. Now it's time to separate the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle by detaching. Detaching the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle will require removal of this cotter pin. Then a 17mm combination wrench can be used for turning that nut off the tie rod ball joint. Using a ball peen hammer for impacting the knuckle of the spindle will help remove this outer tie rod from its connection. It's always best to replace this castle nut to prevent the threads from damaging. With all the bolts and fastener disconnected, now it's time for us to remove this rack and pinion from its cross member support to be refurbished, replace its internal seal, the inner tie rod, and make the necessary adjustment for maintaining a straight line alignment. Care must be taken that the hydraulic line and hoses does not become broken or clogged with foreign contaminant. All lines and passageway must be flushed before reinstall of the hydraulic system. Now it's time for us to take an internal inspection of this rack and pinion to see if it's worth rebuilding. Here we're going to see the rubber boot that prevents water and dirt from entering the hydraulic system is broken. It's time for disconnecting this part, removing the outer tie rod because this inner tie rod will need replacing since the steering wheel is vibrating during driving. All this is going to have to come off the boot, the internal of the rack, both sides. Also, we want to check, see the movement to make sure that it's worth disassembling and it's not grinding or stuck, which is not the case. So let's go ahead and take this apart. Best place for this rack and pinion is a vise on a bench, so we can disassemble it without breaking any part from it falling. The outer tie rod removed, this boot can be slipped off. We want to look in there and look at that seal, trying to move the shaft up or down to see if you have any play. Failure to the center shaft, left and right, oil seal is what's causing a leak. Removal of the left side rubber mount that isolate this rack and pinion from the cross member is critical. Also, this pinion shaft. Careful inspection of the rack and pinion hydraulic system's center shaft complete length and circumference is essential and most important for sealing and preventing oil leak. So this shaft has to be removed and reconditioned with the seal. We will also have to replace these inner tie rod since they're worn out, causing a vibration during driving. Removal of the pinion shaft for the rack and pinion. Careful inspection must be taken to its bearing and the gear, making sure it's not worn out excessively. Also, we want to look inside of the provision where this shaft is installed, making sure it does not show any evidence of damage. So what we are doing right here now is we're removing a lock to allow the center shaft to be completely removed from the body of the rack and pinion. This lock is very important for removal, and as you can see, a pipe wrench is the best tool for doing so. And in your container for catching any oil that may fall out of there. This is where oil and moisture will mix together, causing a corrosion to the outside circumference of the shaft, which will need refinishing for perfection. With the center shaft lock removed, reposition of the rack and pinion, and hammering that center shaft may sometime remove it. If not, it will need to be placed on a press out of its body. Here's an old school rack and pinion press that is manually used for pressing out that center shaft from the rack and pinion. Once that shaft is removed, careful inspection to its body and machine resurfacing it with a sandpaper or some form of machining. You want to take a careful inspection on the outside here. It's the inner seal, and this metal one is the outer seal. So these two seals will need replacing once this shaft is reconditioned to perfectly seal with the inner seal and the body of the rack and pinion. Okay, so this is what the seals look like. Just fell off the shaft during removal. One is an inner seal and one is an outer seal that sits in a washer plate. Evidence of surface rust will be noticed on the center shaft, which will require resurfacing and polishing for reinstalling and perfectly seal. Using a belt sander will be one of the best ways for resurfacing the condition of the center shaft for the rack and pinion. Complete rebuilding of the rack and pinion, installation of new inner tie rod and boot protector will be most important since the old ones are worn out and broken. So before you commit the removal of the steering rack and pinion, it is very important and makes the removal much easier once this area can be degreased. Pressure washing it, removing the dirt and the oil, making it much more convenient for removal. So now we're going to take a look at reinstalling that rack and pinion with a rebuilt or remanufactured unit. The reason why you need to degrease and clean the undercarriage of this vehicle after this power steering leak is because when you take a look at the rubber on that bump stop, you notice it's starting to become deteriorated and most likely will become broken, and that bump stop is very important to preventing that shock from collapsing during the course of a bump. When that suspension contract itself or fold itself in, the shock will push all the way up, damaging its internal plunger. So that is why that bump stop right there is placed, for preventing the shock from collapsing itself. On the other side, you notice there's the same thing. Cleanliness is what makes the job easy. Installation and removal. Part pertaining to the steering linkage that comes from the steering wheel is that you want to make sure that the steering wheel is locked and the key is removed from the ignition, so this part does not turn out of position, because it's very important, or I should say it's critical for alignment with the rack and pinion when it's installed. If this linkage should rotate or be installed in a different position, it will make the steering wheel uneven or not straight during the course of driving a straight line. With the refurbished rack and pinion replaced, the hydraulic steering still remain restrictive due to a clog or restriction in the system. In another video, we will show you how to remove this pump and service to restore steering